They were dividing my house before I was even in the ground. I know that sounds like the kind of thing a bitter old woman says. The kind of thing people dismiss with a soft smile and a pat on the hand. But I am not bitter. I am precise, and what I heard that Sunday afternoon in my own kitchen standing just behind the pantry door, with a mug of chamomile growing cold in my hands, was not imagination. It was arithmetic. My children were doing the arithmetic of my life, and they had already decided the answer. My name is Eleanor. I am 71 years old. I have lived in this house for 43 years. I raised 3 children in it. I buried a husband in it. Metaphorically speaking, Gerald passed in the hospital, but it was this house he came home to every single day of his working life, and it was here I felt him leave. I want to tell you what happened, not for sympathy. I don't need that. I want to tell you because I suspect some of you are living a version of this, and you don't yet have the language for what you're feeling. Let me give you that language. Gerald died 4 years before any of this began. Cardiac arrest, swift and without much ceremony, which was very much his personality. He was a quiet man who fixed things, leaky faucets, bicycle tires, the silence after arguments. He left behind a modest but solid estate, this house, which is paid off and sits on a good piece of land, in a suburb that has only grown more valuable over the decades. Retirement account that Gerald managed carefully for 30 years, and a small portfolio of stocks his father left him. Nothing extravagant, comfortable, the kind of wealth that is invisible until someone starts counting it. Our children are Robert, who is 46, Sandra, who is 43, and Daniel, who is 39. Robert is the one Gerald always called the planner. He works in corporate finance, which means he has spent his entire adult life making other people's money work harder. He speaks in the language of efficiency and practicality, and he has a way of framing every conversation so that whatever he wants sounds like the obvious, responsible choice. He married a woman named Claire 11 years ago. Claire is lovely in the way that a freshly painted fence is lovely, smooth, uniform, and hiding whatever is underneath. Sandra is the middle child and the one I probably understand least. She is warm when she wants to be. She has always avoided unpleasantness the way some people avoid cold water, by standing very still at the edge and waiting for someone else to go first. She would not plan something against me, but she would not stop it either. Daniel is the youngest and the most difficult to categorize. He has made mistakes. He borrowed money twice and paid it back once. He has a good heart wrapped in bad habits. Of the 3, he is the only one I was still genuinely worried about, even at my age. Parents don't stop worrying. I'm not sure we're built to. For the first 2 years after Gerald died, everything was as it should be. The children called. They visited on holidays. Robert handled some of the paperwork that comes with settling an estate, and I was grateful for that. I was grieving, and forms are tedious when you are grieving. He set up a small system for managing bills, suggested I consolidate some accounts for simplicity, and I agreed because it did seem simpler and because I trusted him. I should have read the documents more carefully. Not because he stole from me. He didn't, not then. But I had signed away a small degree of oversight without realizing it, and later I would understand that this was the first brick in a wall I hadn't consented to building. The first sign something had shifted came at Thanksgiving 2.5 years ago. It wasn't dramatic. It was just a comment. Claire said, while I was refilling the bread basket, Robert and I were looking at some options for, estate simplification. It might make things easier, Eleanor, while you're still sharp enough to make these decisions. While I'm still sharp enough, I smiled. I said, we can talk about that. And I went back to the kitchen and stood over the stove and let the words settle into me the way cold settles into old bones. Quietly, completely, still sharp enough. I had just finished reading a 400-page novel the week before. I drove myself everywhere. I had lunch with my friend Margaret every Thursday, and we discussed books and local politics and the inexplicable behavior of younger generations. I was sharp. The comment was not about my sharpness. The comment was about timing. They wanted to have the conversation before I had reasons not to agree. I filed it away and said nothing. 2 months later, Robert came to visit alone, which was unusual. Gerald always said that when Robert visits without Claire, he's working. He brought coffee from the good bakery downtown and we sat at the kitchen table and he talked about the market and about his son's school play and about the gutters on my house needing attention. Then, with the ease of a man who had rehearsed it, he said, "Mom, I've been thinking, for your peace of mind, it might make sense to put some of the assets in a structure that's easier to manage, jointly, with me having oversight." "What kind of structure?" I asked. "Just a trust arrangement, or even just joint ownership on the accounts. So if anything happens, there's no delay, no probate. It's just cleaner." I asked him to leave me some information to read over. He left a folder. I put the folder in the drawer beneath the one where I keep Gerald's old watch, and I didn't open it for a week. When I did, I called a friend of mine, Helen, whose husband had been an estate attorney before he retired. I described what Robert was proposing. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Eleanor, that would give him effective control of your finances while you're still alive." I made us both tea and I sat with that for a long time. I did not call Robert back with an answer. I simply didn't. When he asked, I said I was still reading. When he pressed, I said I found the language confusing and would need more time. This was strategic. I have learned in 71 years that I don't understand is one of the most powerful things a woman can say. People stop pressing. They assume they need to try a different approach. It buys time. I needed time. The Sunday I mentioned, the one with the chamomile and the pantry door, came about 6 weeks after Robert's visit. All 3 children were at the house for Daniel's birthday. It was a good afternoon. We had cake from the bakery, and Daniel's girlfriend brought wine, and Sandra's kids ran around the garden the way children should. I went to the kitchen to get more napkins. The pantry is just off the kitchen, and its door has never hung quite right. It rests open about 2 inches unless you press it deliberately shut. I had gone in to get the napkins from the second shelf, and I heard their voices. "Robert's first. She's not going to move on this unless we all agree on a timeline. Sandra, I just don't want to pressure her. She seemed tired last week." "Robert, she's not tired, Sandra. She's stalling. Look, the house alone at current assessment is worth $600,000. The accounts together are probably another $400. That's $1 million sitting in a structure that could get tangled up in court for 2 years if we don't." "She's 71, Daniel said. His voice had an edge I recognized. "She's not dying." "Nobody's saying she's dying. I'm saying we should be thinking practically. Claire and I talked to someone. There are mechanisms. If we get her to agree to a managed trust with limited revocation." I stopped listening to the words and started listening to the shape of the conversation. Robert had done research. Claire had been involved. Sandra was uneasy but present. Daniel was resisting but not leaving the room. I stood in the pantry with my napkins for what felt like a very long time. Then I pressed the door shut carefully, waited a moment, and walked back out into the hall from the other direction. I put the napkins on the table. I smiled at my grandchildren. I ate cake that evening. After they left, I sat at Gerald's old desk in the study and I wrote down everything I had heard, word for word, as close as I could reconstruct it. I wrote the date. I wrote the names. I wrote managed trust with limited revocation in Robert's words. Then I put the notebook in the drawer with his watch. I did not sleep well that night, but I slept. The following Thursday I had lunch with Margaret as usual. I did not tell her what I had heard. I ate my soup and listened to her talk about her neighbor's fence dispute, and I thought about the folder in my drawer and about Helen's words and about Claire's smile at Thanksgiving. I thought about how a family can be a place of safety and also, depending on circumstance, a place of very sophisticated danger. I called Helen's husband, Edward, the next morning. I asked if he could recommend an estate attorney, not someone who knew Robert, not someone from the firm Robert occasionally used, someone entirely separate. He gave me a name. I called that afternoon. Her name was Patricia. She was in her mid-50s, direct and unhurried. We met on a Tuesday morning and I brought the notebook. I told her what I had heard. I told her about the folder Robert had left. I told her about the joint account suggestion and about Claire's comment at Thanksgiving. I did not frame it as a family tragedy. I framed it as a legal situation. Patricia listened. She asked questions. Then she said, "You came at exactly the right time, and you came to the right place." She explained what Robert's proposal would actually have done. A managed trust with limited revocation, in the form he'd described, would have given him what is called a trustee's discretionary authority. He could have made decisions about asset distribution, including to himself, to Sandra, to Daniel, with constraints so loose they were largely ceremonial. I could have revoked it in theory. In practice, if my health declined or if I became isolated from outside counsel, revocation becomes very difficult to actually execute. I asked how difficult it would be to build my own structure, one that Robert could not touch. Patricia said it would take time, several meetings, and some careful thought. She said, "The goal isn't revenge. The goal is preservation." "I know," I said, "but I also want them to understand what they lost." She looked at me for a moment. And then she nodded. Our first meeting was an information session. I told her about all the assets, the house, the retirement accounts, the stock portfolio, a small savings account, and a piece of land Gerald had inherited from his aunt, 40 minutes outside the city, which none of the children had ever shown much interest in. Patricia took notes. She said she would research the land title and the retirement account structure before our next meeting. We met again 2 weeks later. This time she brought a colleague, a younger woman named Sophia who specialized in charitable trust arrangements. Patricia walked me through 3 options: a revocable living trust with me as sole trustee, a charitable remainder trust for a portion of the assets, and a direct transfer structure for the land. She explained each one carefully without rushing. I asked questions. I took my own notes. I drove home from that second meeting and I made dinner for 1 and 8 at the kitchen table and felt something I had not felt in several months. Not relief exactly, more like footing. Like I had been standing on a slope and I had just found a level place to stand. The children did not know I was meeting with an attorney. I was careful about this. When Sandra called and asked if I'd thought more about Robert's proposal, I said I was still thinking. When Robert texted asking if we could schedule a call, I said I had a busy week. I did not lie. I was busy. I was doing more preparation for the future of my estate than I had done in the previous 4 years combined. The third meeting was about the trust documents. Patricia had drafted a revocable living trust with me as sole trustee and a named successor trustee, not Robert, not Sandra, not Daniel. I had named Margaret's son, a man I had known since he was 12 and who was now a CPA in his late 40s with no stake in my estate. Patricia said, "This was wise." I said I had known William his whole life and I trusted his character. I had also decided by this point what I wanted to do with the assets themselves. The house I would leave to Daniel, but not outright. Through the trust, he would receive it with specific conditions. He must live in it or rent it at below market rate to someone who needed it. He could not sell it for 10 years. If he violated the terms, it reverted to a housing nonprofit I had already identified. I chose Daniel. Not as a reward, but because of the 3, he was the one who actually needed help. And because I believed he might do something real with it, if the structure kept him accountable. The retirement account I restructured. I spoke with the financial institution directly and changed the beneficiary designations entirely, removing all 3 children and replacing them with a donor-advised fund that Patricia and I had set up. The fund's primary directive was to support a literacy program at the elementary school 2 blocks from this house, the same school all 3 of my children attended. From that fund, I could also direct grants during my lifetime, and I intended to. The stock portfolio I divided. A third to a scholarship fund at the community college in Gerald's name. A third to Sandra's children, my grandchildren, not Sandra herself, held in trust until they turned 25. A third to a neighbor's daughter, a young woman named Rosa who had been quietly helping me with groceries and appointments for 2 years and who had never once asked for anything. The land Gerald's aunt had left him, the 40 minutes outside the city, I donated to a land conservation nonprofit, permanently protected, taken entirely out of any inheritance structure. Robert would receive a personal bequest, Gerald's watch, which is a good watch and which I mean sincerely as a gift. It was Gerald's most valued object. Robert admired it openly when his father was alive. He would receive it, and he would know exactly why it was the only thing. Sandra would receive the contents of the cedar chest in my bedroom: linens, photographs, letters between Gerald and me, the children's baby things. I chose this carefully too. These are things Sandra would actually want. Things that have no monetary value. Things that would remind her of who she had been before she learned to be passive. About what mattered. Now, I said I would tell you about the moment things almost went wrong. And I will, because I think it's important that you understand this was not easy, and I was not always certain. This was about 6 weeks into the process, just before our 4th meeting with Patricia. Robert came to the house unannounced. I had not seen him do that in years. He came on a Wednesday morning, when the neighborhood is quiet, and he stood on the porch with a file folder and an expression that was arranged into concern. He said he was worried about me. He said he'd heard I had been having some confusion. He used that word carefully about the paperwork he had left. He said he just wanted to go through it together to make it clearer. I let him in. I made tea. He sat at the kitchen table and he opened the folder and he began to walk me through the documents, and his voice was so reasonable and so warm and so familiar. This was my son's voice. A voice I had heard ask for things since before he could form proper sentences, and there was a moment, a real moment, where I thought, maybe I am making this harder than it needs to be. Maybe this is just Robert being Robert, practical and forward-thinking, and I am reading malice into organization. He slid a document across the table. This one just needs your signature, Mom. It's just the initial authorization. We can deal with the rest later. I picked up the pen. I looked at the document. It was not what he had described. I could see, in the language on the second paragraph, the phrase irrevocable designation of trustee. Authority. Irrevocable. He had said revocable. He had said I could always change my mind. Irrevocable meant I could not. I set the pen down. I said, I need my reading glasses. I left them in the study. I went to the study. I did not get my glasses. I stood in the room Gerald used to sit in every evening, and I breathed slowly and I reminded myself of what Patricia had said. The goal is preservation. I reminded myself of what I had heard through the pantry door. I reminded myself that the man sitting at my kitchen table loved me, and that loving someone and acting in your own interest at their expense are not mutually exclusive. People do both at once all the time. I went back to the kitchen. I sat down. I picked up my actual reading glasses from the table where I had left them, which I had pretended to forget, and I said, very calmly, Robert, this says irrevocable. I thought you said I could change this if I wanted to. He blinked, just once. Then he said, oh, that's the language on this version. I have a different version in the car. Let's wait until you have the other version, I said. I'd hate to sign the wrong one. He left 20 minutes later. He kissed my cheek. He said we would sort it out soon. He was entirely composed and entirely unconvincing. I called Patricia from my car that afternoon, sitting in the parking lot of the grocery store, because I did not want to make the call in the house. I told her what had happened. She was quiet for 3 seconds and then she said, good, you didn't sign. Then she said we needed to move faster. We did. In the 5 weeks following that visit, I went to Patricia's office for more times. I had a physician's appointment where I requested specifically a cognitive assessment, not because I was concerned, but because Patricia had advised having documentation of my full competency on record. The physician, who had been my doctor for 16 years, completed the assessment and noted I scored in the 99th percentile for my age group. He asked why I wanted it on file. I said I was being thorough. He smiled and said he wished more of his patients were. I signed the revocable living trust documents on a clear morning in March. Patricia and Sophia witnessed it. William, Margaret's son, came in and signed his acceptance as successor trustee. We had coffee afterward and Patricia said, without ceremony, you are now the only person with authority over your estate. I drove home and I sat in Gerald's chair in the study and I said out loud, to no one and to him both, it's done. The final meeting, the one you might call the confrontation, though I never thought of it that way, was Patricia's idea. She said if I wanted, she could simply implement everything and send letters. No meeting required. I said no. I said I wanted to be there, not to see them suffer, but because I had spent for years being managed and observed and discussed, and I wanted once to be in the room in a way that was entirely on my own terms. I told the children I wanted to meet with my attorney to go over some estate matters. I said it would be a family conversation. I used that word, family. Robert responded within 6 minutes. Sandra called, Daniel texted a thumbs up and then called 2 hours later, sounding uncertain. They arrived at Patricia's office on a Thursday afternoon in April. The offices were calm and professional and deliberately unintimidating. She had told me once that the design was intentional, that high-stakes conversations go better in neutral, pleasant rooms. There was a small table with water and a bowl of wrapped candies. My children sat down. Claire was not there. I had specified the meeting was for immediate family. Patricia began by explaining that I had completed a full estate plan. She described the trust. She named William as successor trustee. She outlined the charitable designations. She described the beneficiary changes on the retirement accounts. She explained the land conservation donation, which had already been processed and was irrevocable. Robert's expression didn't change. He is trained not to let it change. But his hands, which were flat on the table, went very still. Sandra looked at me. Her eyes had gone soft and uncertain, like she wasn't sure what expression to land on. Daniel looked at the table. Patricia finished and said, "Eleanor would like to say a few words." I had written notes. I didn't use them. I looked at my children, these 3 people I had brought into the world in this very body, and I thought about all of it, the birthdays and the fevers and the arguments and the long ordinary years that are what most of a life is made of. And I thought about a Sunday afternoon and a pantry door and the arithmetic of my life being calculated without me. I said, "Robert, do you remember when you were 7 and you had that bad flu? You had a fever for 3 days. I sat by your bed the second night because you were frightened, and you reached up and held my hand and you said, 'Don't leave, Mama.' And I stayed there until morning." He said nothing. "I heard the conversation you had on Daniel's birthday," I said, "about the house, the accounts, the mechanisms. I heard all of it." Sandra's hand went to her mouth. Daniel closed his eyes. Robert said, "Mom." "I'm not angry," I said. And I meant it. I was not angry. I was past anger by then. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that I understood. I understood what was being planned, and I understood what it meant, and I chose to respond the way I have always tried to respond to difficult things. Carefully, legally, completely. I nodded to Patricia, who confirmed for them again that everything had been executed, the trust, the beneficiary designations, the land, all of it. Robert said, "The land that's gone." "It's protected," I said. "It will never be developed. Gerald's aunt bought it in 1962. I thought it should stay what it is." He looked at Patricia and then back at me, and I saw something cross his face that I had not seen there in a very long time. Not anger, he was too controlled for that in that room. Something more. Complicated. The look of a man recalculating. I looked at Sandra. I said, "The cedar chest is yours. Everything in it." She started crying. I don't know fully what that was about. Relief or guilt or grief, sometimes all 3 arrive at once and can't be separated. Daniel had not looked up. I said his name and he did. His eyes were red. He said, "I didn't, Mom. I said she wasn't dying." "I know," I said. "I heard that too." He put his face in his hands for a moment. It was the most honest thing that happened in that room. The meeting lasted 45 minutes. Nobody shouted. Nobody accused anyone of anything, at least not aloud. Patricia walked them out, and I sat in the pleasant neutral room with the bowl of wrapped candies, and I stayed there for a few minutes after they left, in the quiet. I drove home. I made dinner. I ate at the kitchen table the way I have eaten at kitchen tables for 71 years. The aftermath took shape over the following months, and I want to describe it honestly because there is a version of this story where everything gets resolved and everyone learns and it ends neatly. That is not this story. This is a real one. Robert called me 3 weeks later. He said he wanted to apologize. He said he understood that things had gone too far. He said Claire and he had been, in his word, overzealous. He said it in a tone that was so practiced it was almost sincere. I listened and I said thank you, and I told him I loved him. I do, but I also understood that Robert's apology was partly an apology and partly a reconnaissance. He was trying to understand whether there was still something to be salvaged, whether I might revise the trust. I said nothing that answered that question, because the answer was no, and saying no would only extend the conversation. He still calls on Sundays. We talk about ordinary things. I don't know if we will ever be fully what we were. I suspect not. Some things, once you see them, cannot be unseen. But we are polite, and occasionally we are genuine, and that is more than nothing. Sandra came to the house the week after the meeting. She brought flowers, which was kind. She sat at the kitchen table and cried again and said she was ashamed. I believed her. Sandra is not a bad person. She is a person who chose comfort over principle, and the distance between those two things is the distance between who she is and who she could have been. I told her that. Not cruelly. She stayed for 2 hours and we talked more honestly than we had in years. She still avoids certain topics when we speak. She still goes still when Robert's name comes up. She is trying. I am patient with trying. Daniel called from his girlfriend's apartment 2 days after the meeting. He was quiet for a long time and then he said, "The house. Why did you?" He couldn't finish. I said, "Because I think you'll do something real with it," he said. "What if I don't?" "Then it goes to people who need it," I said. "Either way it matters." He cried for a while. I listened. He is the one who has surprised me most. Since then the conditions of the trust seem to have done something to him. He's been repairing things. Actual things. Physical things. The gutters, which Robert had mentioned needing attention, which Daniel fixed himself one Saturday without being asked. Small things, beginnings. Rosa, my neighbor's daughter, called me when she received the letter about the bequest. She was incoherent for a moment and then she said, "Mrs. Eleanor, you didn't have to." I told her I wanted to. I told her she had been more present in my life over the last 2 years than many people who shared my blood, and that presence deserves acknowledgement. She came over that afternoon and made me tea and we sat together in the kitchen, and it was one of the nicest afternoons I can remember. I want to tell you something now, and I'm going to speak directly. If you are older and you have money or property, you are not automatically safe inside your family. I don't say this to frighten you. I say it because the assumption of safety, the assumption that love protects you, is the thing that makes people vulnerable. Love and self-interest coexist in the people closest to us, and pretending otherwise is not kindness. It's avoidance. The second thing I want to tell you is this. The most important thing I did was not the trust, and it was not the beneficiary changes. It was the decision to write things down. After I heard that conversation, I went to a desk and I wrote down what I had heard with the date and the names. That simple act transformed something I might have convinced myself to doubt into something I could not dismiss. Write things down. Keep your own record. Third, find counsel that is yours alone. Not a family attorney. Not someone referred by your children. Someone who has no relationship with them and whose only obligation is to you. This cost me money and time, and I would spend 10 times more without hesitation. And fourth, the one I think about most, control over your legacy is not greed. I have heard in the years since Gerald died, a quiet cultural message that says elderly people who insist on controlling their own affairs are being difficult, that the loving thing is to let the younger generation take over, simplify things, ease the transition. This is not love. This is convenience dressed as love. You have the right, the absolute right to decide what happens to what you built, until the moment you cannot make decisions anymore. And if you can make decisions, you should be making them yourself. I am 71 years old. I drive myself to appointments. I read. I have lunch with Margaret on Thursdays. I sit in Gerald's chair some evenings and talk to a man who isn't there anymore, which may seem melancholy but is actually one of the more comforting things I do. My life is not over. My choices are not finished. I am still here, still sharp, still deciding. I heard my children calculate my worth and plan my exit before I had taken it. And then I rewrote the ending. Not out of revenge, though I won't pretend there wasn't a quiet satisfaction in that room when Patricia read out the terms. Not out of anger, though I had every right to anger. Out of clarity, out of the knowledge that I had spent 50 years building a life and I was not going to let the last chapter be written by people who were counting the pages. If you are in something like this, if you have felt the subtle shift, the 2 helpful suggestions, the conversations that stop when you enter the room, trust that feeling. Do not dismiss it because it's uncomfortable. Do not dismiss it because these are people you love. Go find your Patricia. Write things down. Do not sign anything you haven't read fully and understood completely, and if you haven't understood it, say so. Say it as many times as you need to. This is your right. Gerald used to say that a good life isn't the one with the most comfortable middle. It's the one where you can look back at how you handled the hard things. I can look back. I handled it.